peeps, welcome to another video. Today it is part 2 of the Vogue 9357 sew along. So today we are going to be starting the skirt and starting the bodice. So let's get started. As you know, I like to start in the middle of the instructions, and this is me we're talking about, so I am going to start with the skirt. I don't think there's going to be very much bias drop on this skirt. It's not that wide, and I am using a very stable cotton. I'm using a quilting cotton, but just in case, I am going to start with that. And the other difference that I'm doing as well is I'm lining my pocket rather than folding in the edges, just because again, it's a preference of mine. So I'm going to start with the pocket, and I'm going to sew my lining pocket to my outer pocket along the pocket opening and then the two side edges, because the top edge and the side edge get caught into the seam allowance of the skirt. So yes, I'm going to get those two sewn together first. I have my outer pinned to my lining, right sides together, words are hard, and I am going to sew down this edge and pivot at the corner and then sew along this edge. I'm going to leave this edge open. I'm also leaving this top edge open, but I am sewing the pocket's opening edge closed. So I'm going to sew across there, and around this corner at 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to pivot at this corner down here. Once you've sewn around this corner and that opening edge there, we need to trim our seam allowances. So I've trimmed the seam allowance here down to half, and then I have clipped very closely around the corner so that we can get a nice pointy point when we turn this through. I'm going to trim the seam allowances on this pocket and then turn them through, and I'm going to turn them through this opening because it's bigger than that one. Okay, so I'm going to go and press this, then I want to top stitch this edge before I top stitch the pocket to the skirt panel. So press and then top stitch this edge. Pockets are pressed flat, and I have top stitched the pocket opening edge. The trick with top stitching is that you want to pick a distance and a stitch length and stick with that throughout your entire project. As long as you use all the same things for each part of top stitching, it'll help your project to look consistent. So now that we've made our pockets, we need to attach these to the front skirt panels. To help me get my pockets in the right place, I have put a pin through the corner where the pocket outline is on the front skirt panel, and I've peeled it back, and where the pin goes through I've made a mark with my chalk pen, and that's where my pocket corner is going to need to meet up with, and I've done that on both sides. Okay, so when you're pinning this down, you want to make sure that you're matching up your notches. There's double notches there. You're matching up the corner point of the pocket with the corner point that you marked. And then I have also just added a notch at the top here where the mark for the pocket was on the skirt piece as well. So there is a little bit of excess room in there, so it's not going to lie completely flat, but you want to make sure that your side seams or the pieces that you're going to top stitch down are lying flat. The next step is to top stitch this down, and we are going to stitch along the upper edge here, top stitch all the way around, pivot at the corner, come back along the bottom edge of the pocket and up this side seam to secure it in place. And we're going to do that for both panels. Now that we have our pockets sewn on to the skirt, we can start assembling the skirt. So I'm going to go back to step 21, and I'm going to stitch center seams of skirt front. I'm also going to move on to step 24, which is stitch skirt front to skirt back at sides, and I'm going to do all of those with a French seam. Okay, so I have sewn the side seams and the centre front seam at 1/4 of an inch with the wrong sides together, and I'm now trimming that seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to do that for both side seams and the centre front, so that I can then press these with the right sides together and finish the French seams. I pressed my seams so that the right sides of the fabric were together, and then I have finished sewing the French seam at 3/8 of an inch, and that has nicely enclosed all the raw edges. So I'm going to press these seams towards the side seams towards the back and the center seam towards the left, because I need to pick a side, and left seems like a good one. So I'm going to get those all pressed, and then I'm going to finish off the back edge of our skirt, or the back seam of our skirt, and I'm going to do that with some bias binding. So I've sewn the right side of the binding, which you can just about see here, so the side without any of the raw edges, so the two folded edges, against the wrong side of the skirt, and I've stitched in the ditch of the crease of the binding, keeping the raw edge of the binding up against the raw edge of the skirt, and I've done that for both of the back seams. So now I need to finish off the binding. So the way I like to do that is with my blind hem foot, and that's because it has this guide down the middle, this blade. So I have moved my needle all the way over to the left, and I am wrapping the binding around the edge of the skirt. So with my right hand, with my forefinger, I like to push the fabric flat, and with my left hand I push the binding flat. And again, trying to do this through the viewfinder is always interesting. So I don't pin anything because I find that doesn't, it kind of distorts things, and it's just an extra step that I don't find that I need. So I'm just pressing the fabric down with my right hand and the binding down with my left hand and sewing along, and you should end up with something that looks like this. So I'm going to do that for the rest of this seam, and then I'm going to do that for the other side, and then we can press. Now that we've finished the skirt portion, we can start on the bodice, which is step number 1. So it's doing the same thing as last time. The last time I made one of these types of dresses with the different cup sizes. For the A and B, it's saying to sew the dart and press it down, and then for the C and the D, it's saying to stitch the dart, trim the darts to 5/8 of an inch, and then press open. I'm going to see what the bulk of the dart is like before I chop into it, although I am fully lining this dress, which is something that this pattern doesn't call for. It won't be the end of the world if I do have to chop my dart open and press chop into my dart and press it open. So anyway, that's going to be the first thing that I'm going to do. Before we take our pattern piece off, we need to transfer over all our notches and markings. So I just clip into my notches very slightly within the seam allowance, and I do the same to the ends of my dart legs, and then I put a pin through the dart point, and I peel back the layers, and I use my friction pen to make a mark where the pin has pierced the fabric, which will help me draw in my dart legs when I remove the pattern piece. So we want to do that for all of the darts going forward, and we have the one dart on the front bodice and we have 2 darts on the back bodice, so we're going to mark all of the darts in the same way. The lower dart leg here is slightly curved, so I'm going to use my French curve, and I'm going to find a point on this that matches that dart leg, and for me it's the 15cm mark at the dart point matching up with the dart leg there, and that gives me the curve that I need. So I'm going to remember that I need to put the 15 on the dart point and draw in my dart leg on both of my bodice fronts. Once you've got your darts all marked in, you are then going to pin them in place, pin through the point, and then make sure that the dart legs are matching up on both sides. You want to backstitch at the start, and then you're going to sew all the way through to and off the end of your point. You don't want to backstitch here because it will make your dart too pointy. So what we're going to do is tie these in a knot to secure our dart. I'm going to do that for all of these, and then we can press. My darts are sewn, and I am just going to tie the ends off to secure them. So you want to make sure this is secured and taut, but you don't want to pull these knots too tight because you'll end up with the same problem. You'll end up with pointy dart ends, or too pointy dart ends, which is not what you want. So I'm going to trim off the excess and thread tails. Now these are very chunky darts, so I think I am actually going to cut them down to 5/8 of an inch and press them open. That's because I'm lining my bodice. This is my lining piece, which I mentioned earlier I cut on the fold. So I'm going to, because we're going to have 4 sets of all of this seam allowance floating around, I am going to trim my dart down and press it open. My darts are trimmed and pressed open, so now we can move on to step 3, which is with right sides together, stitch bodice front sections together at centre front seam. So this is where we have some stripes to chevron, so this is also where, fingers crossed, all the work we did earlier when cutting out will come into play. So what I have done is, remember that we're matching at the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance as well, we don't need to match at this edge. I've put a pin through my stripe, made sure that it comes through at the right point on the other side, and I've done that for all of the stripes. So I'm going to sew this at 5/8 of an inch. You can baste this first to double check that everything is in place. I'm going to sew mine into place with a regular stitch length because it will be fairly easy to unpick that and move things around if I need to, but I'm hoping it's going to work first time. My stripes are all matching up very nicely, so I'm going to go and press that seam open and then we can sew on the yoke. Step 4 wants us to stitch bodice front to yoke front, matching centres, press seam allowance down. I have matched my notches, matched my centres and pinned my yoke to my bodice front, right sides together, and I'm doing the same for my lining. So I'm doing each step twice as I go along, and because I am lining this dress. If you're not lining this dress, you obviously don't need to worry about doing 2 of each. I've decided to add some trim into the front of my dress. It's black trim, which is not showing up very well. So I have centered the trim over the center front seam and I have basted it in, and now I am going to sew the center front to the yoke. And as you can see, I'm doing this later on in the dressmaking stage, but you want to do this way sooner if you want to follow along with me. I'm going to join up the line of stitching here, attaching the front bodice to the yoke. I have pressed the seam allowance down towards the main bodice, so we're going to move on to step number 5, stitch side front sections to bodice front. And by the looks of things, we're pressing the seam allowance down for those ones as well. Okay, so we can now move on to step number 6, which is to stitch the darts in the bodice back and press them towards the centre. So we have a neck dart and we have a waist dart. And again, I am lining mine, so I have 4 pieces that I need to put my darts into. And I'm going to mark my darts in the same way. I'm going to clip into the legs, put a pin through the point and peel back the layers and use my friction pen to mark the layers, then join up the dart legs with my French curve. I have all of my darts pinned in at the neck and at the waist, so I'm going to sew these. I am going to backstitch at the bottom of the dart and then sew off of the tip like we did before, and when we can then tie the knots to secure the tips, and again that will help us to not have too pointy a dart. The next step is to stitch front to back at shoulders matching triangles and stitch the side seams. So we're only going to sew our shoulder seams together because we're going to then attach our lining and we'll be sewing our side seams up last. So I'm going to pin the right sides together of the front to a pair of backs, and I'm going to do that for the lining and for the outer shell. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comments section down below and I shall try my best to answer them for you. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!